So Walter White, he is the ultimate fictional mastermind. He's the man who turned a chemistry degree and a terminal diagnosis into a multi-million-dollar empire, outsmarting everyone from local street dealers to international cartels. But as impressive as Heisenberg was, he never had to face a man like Pablo Escobar. We're talking about the king of cocaine, a real-life titan who didn't just run a drug business, he ran an entire country. While Walt was struggling to hide a few barrels of cash in the desert, Pablo Escobar was so wealthy he famously spent $2,500 a month just on rubber bands to hold his stacks of cash together. So today, we're asking the ultimate hypothetical question. If those two went head-to-head, who would actually walk away? Could a calculated scientific genius like Walter White outsmart the most powerful and violent drug lord in history? Or would his brilliance be completely crushed by the sheer raw power of the Medellin cartel? And to find out who truly wins, we're breaking this one down by level, starting with Level 1, Intelligence, Scientific IQ versus Street Logic. Alright guys, to understand how this battle would go, we have to look at how these two men would think. Walter White's greatest weapon was never a gun or an army, it was his brain, his big galaxy brain. Every time he was backed into a corner, he used chemistry to find his way out. In his early days, when he was taken hostage by Emilio and Crazy 8, he used red phosphorus to create a cloud of phosphine gas. Y'all, this wasn't just a lucky move, it was a calculated use of science to suffocate his enemies and ensure his escape. This is what defines Walt's intelligence, whether it was building a massive battery from sponges and coins to jumpstart a dead vehicle, or using a magnet to destroy a laptop inside of a high-security police evidence room.
Let's go. Let's just go. Hang on. Mr. White, let's get out of here. Just one.
Walt's mind was built for solving impossible problems in the heat of the moment. He didn't just understand science, he knew how to weaponize it. If Walt is put in a room with a lock that he cannot pick, he'll still find a way to create a chemical compound that melts the door off its hinges. But now, Pablo Escobar was a completely different kind of genius. He didn't care about the molecular structure of his product, he cared about the logic of the world. Pablo was a master of logistics and manipulation. Before he arrived, drug smuggling was a small-time operation. He revolutionized the entire industry by thinking like a global CEO. He bought his own private land, Norman's Cay, to serve as refueling stations for his planes. He hired specialized mechanics to hide cocaine inside of airplane tires, and even soaked denim clothes in liquid cocaine to sneak them past customs. While Walt was a genius at solving tactical problems, like knowing how to kill one man in a specific room, Pablo was a strategic genius. He looked at the entire map of the world and figured out how to move tons of product across borders that were supposed to be closed. He outsmarted the Colombian government and the US for decades by understanding how to bribe the right people and stay 3 steps ahead of international law. But in a direct head-to-head battle, intelligence is about who can outthink the other person standing in front of them. Pablo's strategic mind is superior for building an empire, sure, but Walt's IQ is on another level for an individual to survive. He can look at a massive, complex system and find one tiny scientific or psychological weakness that makes the whole thing collapse. So guys, I have to give this section to Walter White, because in a battle of pure individual IQ and the ability to turn any object into a weapon, Walt is the sharper mind. Winner, Walter White. However, a brilliant mind is useless if you don't have the resources to back it up, right? To see how these two actually built their kingdoms, you gotta look at their operations. Level 2, Operations, Quality versus Quantity. Alright guys, so in the world of a legal business, there are 2 ways to dominate a market. You either have the best product, or you have the most product. Don't ask me how I know that. This is where the gap between Walter White and Pablo Escobar becomes massive. Walter White's entire operation was built on the foundation of precision. He produced meth with a 99.1% purity level, an accomplishment that no other cook could replicate. And since his product was the best on the market, it gave him a unique kind of leverage. Powerful figures like Gus Fring needed him alive because the blue sky meth was their biggest moneymaker. However, Walt's operation, it was always small and fragile. Even at his peak, his business relied on a handful of people, Jesse for cooking, Mike for muscle, and Saul for legal cover. But because his team was so small, any single point of failure could bring the whole house down, right? If one of the Vamonos pest houses was raided or one partner talked to the DEA, the entire business was at risk. Then we got Pablo Escobar over here, on the other hand, who ran a massive global business that prioritized volume over everything else. He didn't care about a 99% purity rating because he controlled the entire supply chain, from the seeds in the ground to the planes in the sky. While Walt was worried about a single fly in his lab, Pablo was managing a network that moved 15 tons of cocaine every single day. His operation was so massive that it feels less like a drug ring and more like a private government. He had thousands of employees, including a private army of assassins known as sicarios. Pablo's production also wasn't limited to one secret basement. He had jungle labs scattered across the country. These weren't clean or scientific, they were industrial sites hidden deep in the rainforest where workers processed massive amounts of cocoa paste. If the authorities raided one of these labs, it didn't matter. Pablo had dozens more ready to take its place. He owned the transport, the protection, and the politicians, unfortunately. The real difference is that Walt ran a tiny operation focused on making one perfect product, while Pablo ran a massive industry that moved as much as possible across the entire world. It's like when SpongeBob faced off King Neptune with the Krabby Patties. In a war of operations, quality can't beat a man who owns the entire world's supply. You can't outcompete someone who can lose 10 labs and won't even notice it on his balance sheet. Pablo Escobar's reach and ability to survive massive losses makes him the undisputed winner of this round. Winner, Pablo Escobar. But money and planes aren't enough to stay in power, because you also have to control how people think of you, which brings us to how these two men used fear to stay on top. Level 3. Psychology and Fear. So to rule a criminal empire, you have to control how people perceive you. Both Walter White and Pablo Escobar used fear as a foundation, but the way they projected that fear was completely different. Walter White created the myth of Heisenberg. At first, he was just a desperate man in a beige jacket, but he eventually transformed into a figure that scared even the most hardened criminals.
Who the hell are you?
You know. You all know exactly who I am.
However, Walt's real psychological power, it wasn't just violence, it was manipulation. He excelled at making people believe they were nothing without him. He convinced Jesse that he was the only partner who cared about him, and he convinced Gus that his chemistry was the only thing keeping the business alive. Walt used these tactics to control the people in his immediate circle. He wanted to be respected and recognized as the smartest man in the room.
I am not in danger, Skyler. I am the danger.
But that danger, it was often a mask he wore to hide his insecurities. His reputation as Heisenberg was a fragile image that required constant maintenance and lies. But with Pablo Escobar, he didn't need a mask or a secret identity. Everyone knew who he was, and everyone knew his rule: plata o plomo, silver or lead. There was no room for manipulation or psychological games. You either took his bribe, or you and your entire family were killed. It was a simple, brutal choice that he applied to everyone from street cops to the president of Colombia. But Pablo's psychology, it went deeper than just being a monster. He understood the power of being a man of the people. While he was ordering the deaths of hundreds, he was also building schools, hospitals, and housing for the poor in Medellin. This created a level of loyalty that Walt could never achieve. Thousands of people were willing to die for Pablo because they saw him as a savior. If Walter White built up a couple of Chick-fil-A's, then maybe things would be a little bit different, but no, whatever. Walt's influence was limited to the Albuquerque drug scene and a few international connections, while Pablo's shadow covered multiple countries. When a man has the loyalty of the poor and the fear of the powerful, his psychological grip is almost impossible to break. In a battle of who commands more authority and fear, it's clear that Pablo stands far above Walter. Winner, Pablo Escobar. So, being feared helps you control your territory, we know that now, but it also makes you a massive target for the police. And because of that, both men had to develop ways to keep their work hidden while they were operating right in front of the people, trying to catch them. We're at level 4 now, security and counterintelligence. Walter White and Pablo Escobar were experts at hiding, but they used completely different methods to stay out of handcuffs. Walter White's entire security strategy was based on being a nobody. He didn't have bulletproof cars or high-tech scanners and relied on the fact that no one would ever suspect a middle-aged chemistry teacher with a family was capable of running a multi-state meth operation. Even when he started making millions, he kept his lifestyle modest to avoid drawing the attention of the IRS or the DEA. He used a legitimate business like the A1A car wash to launder his money and provide a clean front for his wealth.
If you're gonna launder money, Walt, at least do it right. You worked here 4 years. It's a business you understand. It's a story people will believe.
However, Walt's security was incredibly fragile because it was built solely on made-up lies. His counterintelligence was just him lying to his family and his DEA brother-in-law, Hank. So this meant that his entire world, it would collapse if just one person talked. Whether it was Jesse becoming a liability or Skylar deciding she'd have enough and going to the cops, Walt's security didn't really have layers. Once the secret was out, he had no army to protect him and no politicians to bail him out. He was just one man, a guy, and that's a very easy target for the authorities to hit. Mr. Escobar, he also hid in plain sight, but he did it with the power of an army and a mountain of cash. Pablo's security was a sophisticated network that covered entire cities. He used calzones or lookouts on every street corner in Medellin to track the movement of police and rival gangs. He had access to high-tech radio scanners to listen in on the freaking government and their communications, often knowing about a raid before the police even left the station. More importantly, Pablo's security was built on something I previously mentioned, plato o plomo, the bribe. He didn't just hide from the law, he owned the law. He had thousands of police officers, soldiers, and government officials on his payroll. If a high-ranking official tried to investigate him, Pablo would simply buy them or kill them. His security was a political and financial shield that made him nearly untouchable for years. The weakness in these two systems is the biggest difference. Walt's security fails the moment a single person in his life makes a mistake or feels guilty. Pablo's security only fails when an entire government, backed by the United States, decides to spend millions of dollars and years of time to hunt him down. In a battle of who is harder to catch and who is being protected, Pablo Escobar is simply in a completely different league. And so the winner, Pablo Escobar. But knowing how to hide is only half the battle. To see who wins in a real fight, we need to look at how they move from staying hidden to actually taking out their enemies. Level 5. Tactics. When it comes to actual combat, the way these two men handle a threat is the difference between a surgical strike and a natural disaster. To understand who wins a direct confrontation, we have to look at how they eliminate their most powerful enemies. Walter White's tactic is to find the one person at the top and look for their single point of failure. This was pretty clear in his war with Gustavo Fring. Gus was a man who had more money, more soldiers, and better security than Walt. In a normal fight, Walt would have lost in seconds, and he knew that. So instead, Walt used a combination of psychological traps and a homemade explosive to turn Gus's own environment against him. He realized that Gus's generational hatred for Hector Salamanca was his only weakness, and he used a pipe bomb hidden in a wheelchair to take down an untouchable leader. Walt's tactics rely on stealth and the element of surprise. He uses things like ricin, a poison that's almost impossible to detect, to kill enemies without ever being in the same room as them. Y'all, he used a remote-controlled machine gun in the trunk of a car to wipe out an entire gang while he laid flat on the floor. You just don't see Walt coming, and by the time you realize you're in a fight, it's kind of already over. We see Walt constantly win because he's willing to spend weeks planning a 10-second interaction that ends in a kill. But then Pablo Escobar's tactics, they were the exact opposite. He didn't care about being quiet or subtle. His method was total war. If a politician or a judge stood in his way, Pablo didn't send an assassin with a poison needle or something. He sent a team to blow up a commercial airplane. I'm not joking, I'm not exaggerating. In 1989, he bombed Avianca Flight 203 just to kill one presidential candidate who wasn't even on the plane. He also organized the attack on the Palace of Justice, where he used a guerrilla group to raid the highest court in the country. This resulted in the deaths of over 100 people, including half of the Supreme Court justices. Pablo's tactics were designed to create so much noise and destruction that the entire world stopped to watch. This was incredibly effective for intimidating a government, but it also had a major drawback. It created too much attention. Every time Pablo used brute force, he gave his enemies more reasons to unite against him. While he could destroy a building, he couldn't necessarily hide from a single, determined person who knew where to look. In a head-to-head war where they're hunting each other, Pablo would try to burn down the city to find Walt. But Walt, he only needs one opening. And since Walt specializes in taking down people through patience and science, he's the one more likely to land the first blow and the only fatal blow. Winner, Walter White. And that brings us to our final big comparison. Could Walt assassinate Pablo? This is where we play out the what if and see if Walt's brain can beat Pablo's enemy. Level 6, the war scenario. Alright, y'all, so to settle this debate, we have to imagine what a direct war would look like. If Pablo Escobar decided Walter White, Heisenberg, needed to die, the fight would be over before it even began. Pablo wouldn't send a message, he would send 50 men with assault rifles to Walter White's house. In a head-on collision, Walt has no defense against that kind of raw power and would simply be dead in an hour. But the real question is, what if Walt was the one hunting Pablo? So in this scenario, Walt actually has a chance. Pablo's biggest weakness was his ego, and he needed to be loved by the public. He regularly attended charity events, gave speeches at political rallies, and walked through crowded neighborhoods to hand out cash. To a man like Walter, these public appearances would be everything he'd need. Walt would look for a way to use Pablo's environment against him. He could use his chemistry knowledge to plant a colorless, odorless poison like ricin on a gift or a microphone. He could design a remote-controlled explosive, similar to the one he used on Hector to kill Gus, and hide it in a place where Pablo felt safe. And since Pablo was a man of the people, he was constantly shaking hands and meeting strangers, so this makes him an incredibly vulnerable target to all sorts of stuff like ricin or a perfectly set trap. So the conclusion is pretty simple. Pablo Escobar was someone who loved to win by destroying everything in his path, while Walter White only needed to destroy the man at the top. If Walt could stay hidden long enough to set one trap, he's one of the few people capable of taking down the king of cocaine. And guys, if you enjoyed this video, please check out our video on Is Hank Evil? It's a banger, I'll be there, and hopefully you are too. Thanks for watching, commenting, and have a good one. Bye-bye!